I've never done that before. Like, what do I do? I wrote my CI PPE exam. It's an IPP exam for privacy. But that also didn't provide sufficient guidance. So what we have within the presentation and workshop today is basically what I've been able to sort of crowdsource and find out with respect to privacy data protection. A guide for most people who are starting up in new organizations, trying to institutionalize or set up or establish a privacy program, or for people already working as a privacy professional in an organization, and you are challenged with how do you enhance your privacy program, right? We'll jump right into it. So this is the outline. What's the problem? What should we do? How do we go about it? And also, what do we do now? I always start my talk about privacy about this important, important work. In the sense that the whole of privacy or the whole of data protection is really focused about how do we protect humans, right? How do we protect people? How do we protect personal data of people? Because it's really about humans. And that's what I want this talk to be about. And that's why I hope that in our various organizations, we work as privacy professionals or even security professionals, we are concerned about people and also how does our organization manage their data. So what I'm going to do in the next few slides is going to sort of depict what happens in an organization, right? We start off with an organization, and this is an example of that organization, where it's a fintech organization, basically providing financial technology services, and they deal with a lot of personal data, right? So they have third-party vendors, where they also share some of those personal data with also service providers. But there's been a recent breach in that organization. And what we found out was that there was no privacy program, even though they had some bit of privacy activities or tasks inside this main organization, but there was no really holistic privacy program. And they also had some security policies, which is very common to most organizations. We have all bunch of security policies, which is probably gathering dust somewhere or hosted in a repository, and people go to it once in a while. So the same thing applies to the organization. And the co-founders, Alice and Bob, for any crypto nerds here, they decided that, you know what, why not let's start up a privacy program? And they are faced with three options. The first one is, you know what, we'll just hire a consultant, right? This is very typical. So you go, some of these big names, and they come into the office to establish a privacy program. And the other is inside that, you know what, you don't really care about privacy, right? They're not going to do anything about the data breach. And that's the case of the Oxford Common. You take your privacy seriously, right? But they decide that, you know what, we are going to take your privacy seriously, right? No Oxford Common there. And they decided to hire a top privacy officer. And the privacy officer's name is Walter, also another crypto name. So Walter joins the organization, right, as a privacy professional or the CPO, for example, the chief privacy officer. And the next thing Walter needs to do basically is to understand what's the organization's vision and mission, right? Because you need to tie this back to, you need to tie the privacy program back to the organization's mission and vision. If it's an organization that really doesn't care about people, right, doesn't care about people's personal data, it's going to reflect in your privacy program, right? Or you're basically trying to use or exploit people's personal data, right? So you need to understand what kind of organization it is. And that's what Walter did, right? He sat down with Alice and Bob and tried to understand what's the mission of the organization, what's their intent towards the use of personal data, right? And it could be different things, right? Today, we have organizations that use personal data to increase their revenue. They monetize personal data, right? There are so many organizations doing that today. So they have through ads or all sorts of things. I'm not mentioning any names. For some organizations, they're really concerned about their information assets, right? The applications, the infrastructure, and some of those information assets which they use on a day-to-day basis. And for some of them, they are concerned about the brand, right? And how they take that personal data and also how that affects the brand. So this might be a number of reasons why organizations are concerned about institutionalizing or establishing a privacy program. But I think the most important part I want to leave us with is at some point in time within the organization, right? It shouldn't just be about compliance. And this is also about security. It shouldn't just be about, I want to comply to this standard, I want to comply to this regulation. It should really be about how do you get value from that security program, or how do you get value from the privacy program. So Walter finds that out. And as part of his mission too, his next step as part of what Walter needs to do is basically to go on a regulatory tour in terms of understanding what's the scope of the privacy program, what's the context which it needs to deal with within the organization, and also outside of the organization, and also what are the requirements. And I'll explain what this means. In some jurisdictions, right, privacy program or privacy compliance is mandated as a result of maybe government regulation, or it might also be sectorial regulations if you work in the health sector. As a result of that, you need to establish some privacy program within the organization, right? You might not call it privacy program, but you need to have some activities that relate to privacy. And this is basically what Walter needs to do. He goes on that tour, exploring the organization, right? Trying to understand what's the context of the organization, what does the organization do, right? What kind of personal data do we collect? How do we process that personal data? That's the first thing that needs to be on Walter's mind. Then he also needs to establish what role do they play when it comes to data protection. Are they a controller and also are they a processor, right? Or are they a joint controller? And all these things are well established and also well defined. I also mentioned this to understand the type of personal data that the organization collects. Also, what are the organizational needs or what are the stakeholder needs? I've mentioned about the internal stakeholders and also the external stakeholders. What's their requirements? What's the expectation when it comes to privacy or data protection within the organization? Then we also need to consider what are the applicable local laws. For example, in Canada, right? So we have like a federal data protection act, right? But in separate provinces, there are also specific data protection acts or regulations. And also, even in sectors within each provinces, there are also separate data protection regulations. For example, like I said, if you work within the health sector. So you need to determine which one is applicable to the organization based on what you do. And that's what Walter did. But while he's on this tour, it's also important that Walter tries to get buy-in from the various stakeholders within the organization, right? So it's not basically just trying to determine the context of the organization, he's also trying to partner with people within the organizations, whether it's the chief marketing officer that deals with data and uses that data, or maybe it's the CRO or the security officer, basically partners with them, trying to understand and also build a relationship with them. And it's also informally pitching a privacy program. Like we said, the organization has some privacy practices, but I mean, it's not a program. It's very much still an adult privacy practice. So it starts as much as possible to preach privacy program to different people within the organization, especially at a very senior level. Then it begins to also identify people who are going to support this cause, right? In terms of establishing a privacy program. But that's the happy part, right? Expecting that people will listen to him and also support him. There's also the rabbit hole which you can actually get into. And there are different kinds of people within the organization, right? That can actually push him down the rabbit hole and basically just make him focus on establishing that privacy program. And these are basically just some of them. You can have some of the crypto nets that are basically just, let's just encrypt everything, right? And there's really nothing to worry about, right? Or let's anonymize all the data, right? And when you anonymize personal data, it doesn't come under the scope of data protection regulation anymore, right? Because it's not personal data. And all sorts of people within the organization. So, what did Walter discover during this talk? He discovered that as a result of the breach, there's been a decline in customer satisfaction and also erosion of trust. Right? There was a data breach in the organization, and they begin to sort of reduce customers. Customers no longer trust them, right, because of that breach. We also noticed that there's been increased awareness fueled by the 2018 GDPR, right? When GDPR came out, then everybody just went wild about data protection and privacy, right? In various jurisdictions, people are coming up with different legislation, very, very close and similar to the GDPR, and building regulations and also acts with respect to data protection or related to data protection. So you also discovered that the same thing applies to country where it's working in, and there are various regulations. And Walter has been 2 months in now, right? He has just been going on tours trying to understand the organization. But Alice and Bob are beginning to ask him, we need to see results, which is quite common in organizations. You join an organization as a privacy program, as a CPO or as a chief security officer, within a month or two, the CEO is actually asking for answers, right? Especially when there's been a breach. They ask you, what are you doing? Or you're still going on the tour trying to understand the context of the organization, which is very, very important to your success within the organization, right? But as a result of this, Walter decides that the next thing he needs to do really is not just to jump into action, right? He needs to understand that he needs to build a program, and to build a program, you need a framework, right? There's no need reinventing the wheel. There are so many frameworks these days which you can rely on. So he begins to ask himself, what framework should I use? Right? So that's the next task for Walter. And there are quite a number of them. Another challenge faced by Walter. Quite a number of frameworks. So he begins to wrap his brain and decide, okay, you know what should I do here? Because there are so many frameworks, depending on the industry, depending on the jurisdiction, and also depending on the context of the organization. And another rabbit hole to be very, very mindful of, which I've seen in some organizations, is they get a tool and decide that tool will fix all the problem. Right? It happens in security, it also happens within privacy. So we need to be very, very mindful of that. There's no silver bullets. There's no one single tool that will fix all your privacy worries. The same thing with security. Right? So let's be very, very mindful of that. There are frameworks which you can use. There are best practice standards which you can use. There are also solutions, but those solutions need to address specific concerns which your gap assessments are actually identified. And I'll go into that in a very small bit. One of the things which I've done earlier on was to do an analysis of some of those frameworks, right? And these are basically just an example of 3 of them. There is ISO 27001, which is called the PIMS, the Privacy Information Management System. There is also NIST. NIST was recently updated with specific privacy controls. It's a very, very beautiful document, which is quite good. And there's also the EU GDPR, right? Which I said most legislations today are basically just like I'm sorry to say that, they are more like a copy and paste of the GDPR to some extent, right? So one of the things that's very, very important for you to know is really around what are the similarities between these programs or between these frameworks and standards, and also what are the differences, and also how relatable are they to the kind of organization where you find yourself. So for some organizations, they are very small and nimble, right? They don't have all the money in the world. That might impact on kind of framework which you select within the organization. And for some organizations, they are very global. They have all the money to spend. That might impact on the implementation cost. Some organizations also like to sort of reflect what they've done with respect to privacy on their brand, right? So things around certification, for example, is very, very important for some organizations, because at the end of the day, I want to show I have a certificate that says I am implemented some privacy regulation or privacy program. So those are some of the things that's worth considering when you're selecting privacy framework or best practice standards. And also, more importantly, is the timeline for some of these programs, right? Or for some of these frameworks. And I've just judged there that if you're trying to implement NIST and EU GDPR, it's like it's continuous, it's never ending, right? But for the PIMS, for example, Within 6 months, I've seen some organizations do this from start to finish, where they do an assessment related to PIMS and they get certified in about 6 months. For some organizations, it's been a year. And I've also seen this done in our organization about 3 months, right? Very small organization, did the assessment, implemented PIMS, and got certified within 3 months. I've said there are so many of these organizations, there are so many of these frameworks, and Walter decides that he's going to select any one of these frameworks. I don't have a response, I don't have an answer to which is the best framework. All of them are good, right? So as an organization, as a CPO, you need to determine which is best for your organization. And that's what Walter did. He determines which one is best for his organization. And the next step really is, what does the privacy program look like, right? But before he jumps into it, he needs to develop a strategy, which is what Alice and Bob are actually looking out for, right? Like, this is what I intend to do within my year, or within a year, or within 3 years as the chief privacy officer, or as a privacy professional. And this is basically just a very quick summary of what the strategy is like. And this is what the strategy is. So he decides that in the first few months, or the first quarter, he's going to go around doing some privacy education, awareness, education, I call it T. Training, education, and awareness, right? So it decides he's going to do that. And the next big block basically is around starting to implement the privacy program by itself. And the brass ring on the last tab there is really around how do you ensure you can continuously update and maintain and improve, which is more important, the privacy program. And those are some of the key things which you need to start thinking about at that improvement stage, right? So this is what Walter came up with as a strategy, and also as a response to Alice and Bob asking him, "You've been here for 2 months. What are you really going to do?" Right? So he came up with a strategy and also a plan and shared with Walter and Bob. Let's take note of that second item, right? Where I mentioned assessment and compliance to selected primary framework. That's really the crux of implementing the privacy program, right? So for Walter, the next step after submitting that plan to Alice and Bob is really around doing a diagnostics assessment. What's the problem, right? It's like going to the GP, right? And you say, you know what, just give me a drug. The first question is going to ask you is, what's the problem, right? I'll need to test you. That's the same thing that Walter did. He needs to do a diagnostic assessment, right? There's been a breach. We have some policies here and there, but I need to understand comprehensively what's the full scope of the problem related to privacy or data protection within the organization. So it takes any one of those framework and it does a gap assessment. Say, these are the requirements of the framework, and this is where we are as an organization, right? Across various areas, and those are some of the areas which I've mentioned here, right? So for example, the IAPPC IPM mentioned some of these areas: the privacy notice, data discovery and mapping, purpose limitation, individual rights. The privacy outlook is one of the beautiful documents by Gartner. It's very, very exhaustive, and those are some of the areas which are mentioned by Gartner within the privacy outlook. And here, some of the information which I've seen over the internet, which relates to sort of GDPR, and also trying to constrain GDPR into about 10 blocks of category, right? Under strategy, policy, cross-border data strategy, transferring mechanisms, data lifecycle, privacy by design, security, which is the list of privacy, and also incident management. So it looks across each one of these domains and does gap assessment for the organization. Where do we stand, right? And for some of those frameworks, the actual detailed questions or detailed questionnaires with respect to what are the questions which you need to ask, right? And if Walter cannot do that, basically just calls in some of those consultants to do the work on it, right? So, but it does a gap assessment or a diagnostic assessment, whatever it's called. And this is what some of those things look like. Sorry, I've sort of blurred this out because these are like proprietary materials by some of those consultants, right? So after the assessment, they submit a beautiful report, right? Which is probably much more than the actual assessment being done, right? Very colorful reports and tell you this is the level of effort required, this is what you need to do, this is the time period. Basically, a gap assessment report showing these are the gaps and these are the recommendations. And that's basically Walter's working paper. Am I too fast, please? Now, Walter has a plan. Sorry, Chris Rock. The only person who was taking the point and still continue to present. So Walter needs to be aware of this, right? He has a plan, he has a strategy, right? And he also has a lower level plan in terms of what the gaps are and also what the recommendations are, right? So he takes this and it begins to work. And the next step really for Walter, and everything which you have from after this stage are action items that Walter needs to do in terms of implementing the privacy program. Like I said earlier on, the cost of privacy program is really around data, personal data. So the first step really is around understanding what personal data you hold within the organization, right? What's the personal, are they personal data, sensitive data? And the outcome of that are some of the things which I mentioned in some of those data protection regulations. The most important outcome from you conducting a data mapping or a data discovery exercise is what's called the ROPA, the record of processing activities, right? I think this thing called ROPA. I'm not sure the GDPR mentions that as ROPA, but it's one of the outcome or the artifact from you doing a data analysis or a data discovery. So you create a ROPA, which is basically a record of processing activities, taking a look at all the activities within the organization, right? What kind of data is required for those processing activities, or what kind of data is generated as a result of those processing activities? What's the input to the processing activities, and also what's the output to processing activities, right? And you can also begin to do what is called a data map, right? How does data flow within the organization? And all the other thing is also to do with data lifecycle, right? So across the organization, how do you create data, right? Who uses that data? Where is that data being stored? Do we share with the third party externally, and also who do we share with internally? Which are some of the key things we need to document as part of the roadmap. So if a business unit, for example, say IT, creates data, you also need to document and map who IT share that data with within the organization, because there are touch points within the organization who use that data, and also outside of the organization. So that's part of the processors that actually use that data. So you come up with the life cycle of the data, right? And like I said, one of the key outcomes from this is having a ROPA. It's actually mandatory in some of the data protection regulations. You need to have a record of processing activities. The next step, and I'll spend some bit of time on this, is conducting a PIA. And different regulations call this different things. It's either called a DPIA, Data Privacy Impact Assessment, or Data Protection Impact Assessment. And the reason why this is key is this. You start as the privacy professional or the CPO, the organization is going to continue to operate. They are not going to wait for you to create your plan, your strategy, and follow through your plan or strategy. The organization will continue to operate. As a fintech organization, like I gave in the example, we are building products, right, that consumers are going to use. And there are going to be iterations of those products, or there are probably new products which they are going to start creating. For each one of those products, we need to do what's called a PIA, a privacy impact assessment, right? And that's one of the key steps. And this is done not only for products, it's also done for projects and also new processes. You basically identify how each of those projects, the processes, or the products actually utilize data, and also what's the impact to the customers or the consumers whose data are going to be used as a result of that process, the project, or the process. And those are some of the things which are contained within the privacy impact assessment, right? You give an example of what the description of the project, what are the goals and time frame, the personal information or personal data which is going to be used by that product, and you also identify what the risks are. Like some of those things are documented there, right? Who accesses the data? Who is the data being shared with? How do you ensure the accuracy of the data? How do you ensure that the data is actually secure? So those are some of the key questions which you need to answer. And for security professionals like myself, the PIA is basically just risk assessment. The same way we do risk assessment in security, where you identify the assets, you identify what the vulnerabilities are, you identify the threats, you identify the impacts and probability, you identify the risk, then you begin to identify what the controls are, right, or what the recommendation. It's basically very, very similar. Paris professionals like to call it a PIA, but it's really risk assessment. And the intent of this, or the goal of this, of the PIA, just like the goal of the risk assessment, is to identify what controls will help you mitigate your risk. For the PIA, the intent really is around identifying the controls that will help you manage the risk associated to personal data. We're not talking about information assets here, we're focused on personal data. How do you ensure that the risk to individuals who owns that data is sort of minimized, right? So you'd also want to have things like your threshold, where you have like, which is called like risk appetite in security, where you want to ensure that for every risk that's identified from the PIA, you want to sort of mitigate it to really a medium or a low based on your risk appetite or your risk acceptance criteria. The reason why I did put policy first, right, which most people will probably do, is in some organizations, the starting point is really around policy, right? They would say develop a policy first. But I feel like it's important for you to understand the kind of data you process before you document your policy. Without that, your policy will not be comprehensive and will not be rich, or will not address what the concerns are. And I've mentioned policy and notice here, basically to differentiate two different things. I'm sure that privacy professionals will get the joke. It's not called a privacy policy, it's called a privacy notice if it's an external facing document. An internal facing document is called the privacy policy, right? So all those things you see on websites, privacy professionals would say, no, don't call it policy, call it a privacy notice. Because really, the intent of it is to provide fair information processing notice to the customers, to tell them how you're going to use their data, right? And how you're going to protect it. They're not really enforcing anything on them, which is what policy is about, right? Policy is around statements of top management's intent and direction. And it's really enforced on people within the organization. You can't enforce anything on your customers because you are basically using your personal data. So it's the obligation on you is to tell them how you're going to use their data and how you're going to protect it and how you're going to secure it. So for the external facing document, it's being called privacy notice. And for internal document, we call it privacy policy. The other thing that goes into that is, like I said, understand the data which you process first before you create your policy and your privacy notice. The other aspect of this is a cookie policy or a cookie notice, which also is always documented as part of the website. And for the cookie notice, you need to explain what cookies are actually embedded on your website, right? So if you do not understand what cookies you use, how are you going to create that notice, right? And the tip, which is not documented here, is there's a beautiful website. It's called Web Call DataSpeed. It basically analyzes your website and tells you what cookies are actually running on your website. And for privacy policy, the best I've seen out there is what is called Juro Privacy Notice. It's the best, well-written, and the most beautiful privacy notice which I've actually seen. And it's actually open source. So you can actually go and download it and use it for your organization. Juro Privacy Notice, and also Web Call DataSpeed for analyzing some information on your website. And you can also use Wikipedia too, which tells you what those cookies are and what they do, right? So you have identified the cookies, and you can put it on Wikipedia and it tells you what those cookies do. So all those information goes into your privacy policy, goes into your privacy notice and also your cookie policy, right? You have third parties, right? Then you also need to begin to worry about agreement with those third parties, which are also mandated by regulations, right? Standard contractual clauses, BCLs, and all other agreements. So that's the next step which you need to do. So you go to the guys in legal and say, you know what, which must have been done as part of the gap assessment. Let me see the agreement. Does it cover us from a privacy point of view? And there are resources out there today. The EU GDPR or East Europa has standard contractual clauses which you can actually download and send to the legal team, and they can incorporate some of the privacy requirements or privacy clauses into some of your legal contracts, especially those that involve controllers and also processor relationship. Right? The other thing to worry about here is adequacy decisions. I've seen this play out in some jurisdictions where you can send data to some other countries, or you have to localize data, right? You can't send some specific data out of the country. So those are some of the key things which you need to worry about. But you cannot do all these things until you get to know what data do you hold as an organization, which why that is very, very important. For choice and consent, there's a YouTube video called Tea and Consent. It's a very, very beautiful video that tells you what consent means, right? It's on YouTube. I've forgotten the name of the those people who made the video. But what I've seen, and also part of my reading, I thank Gartner for this, is we are beginning to move into, or the idea right now is around moving into what is called privacy self-serve, right? And what that means really is giving control back to the users so that they can self-serve themselves when it comes to data protection and privacy. So in that sense, the user is not sending you a DSAR, right? It's not sending you a subject access request. You can go to your website and also self-serve and say, you know what, I want to see all the data that this company knows about me. You're going to send you an email and you begin to walk your operational processes, trying to get all the information about the user. It takes about a month or thereabouts, you send it to them. Why don't you give that power back to the user? Right? It reduces operational costs and also reduces the turnaround time mandated by regulations where you need to respond to a DSAR request. Right? A DSAR request is subject access request where the user sends an email to you and say, I want to know all the data you have about me. And you have to actually oblige and provide that information according to those regulations. And we've seen some of the things around choice and consent around privacy UX, right? So today, when you go to most websites, it will tell you what kind of cookie do you want to enable, right? Strictly necessary, and also all these other names. Those are part of the idea behind privacy UX, right? And also some definitions around what consent really means. Then you work with your team, right? Because across various functions, people are collecting personal data. HR collects personal data for employees, marketing collects personal data from customers, legal, contact center. As a fintech organization, people are calling you, right? Maybe with card holder information with their names. They also record that data, right? You need to understand how those data are being managed. But you can't do it by yourself. So you need to work with the various team members to understand the data and also build processes within those various teams and how they are going to continue to manage data and also how to process the data. I have a joke there. Don't ask me where the privacy function should sit. I have no answer to that. So when it comes to teamwork, what does success mean? And this is what I've seen play out in most organizations. At every point in time, when someone they're out of a meeting, and someone can say, "Let us ask the privacy officer," right? At that point in time, you know you've actually succeeded in your privacy program, right? Because the message is out there. When people have privacy questions and they're saying you're out of that meeting or you're out of that situation, and people are saying, "Let's ask the privacy officer." That is what success means to me, because they've sort of disseminated privacy knowledge across the organization. They know that they need to ask you when they're in doubt, right? You have processes established, you have policies in place, you do regular awareness, people understand the importance of securing and protecting personal data, but where there are doubts, they say, let's ask the privacy officer. That's really what success really means. There are some other things which you need to do as a privacy officer, data protection by design, data protection by default. Some of these things are you need to sort of embed them into established processes. So for organizations today, especially IT organizations, they have things around threat modeling, and that was just being talked about in the last track I was in. They do threat modeling today, right? As part of security best practice for rolling out new processes or new products, right? You can actually embed some of your privacy principles into that threat modeling exercise. And I give an example. Within the last organization I worked with, before we roll out a new feature, we do the threat modeling, which is basically focused on security. But we also started doing the data impact assessments for each one of those products or for each one of those features. It was just a single process. It wasn't called security and privacy. Just a single process where you do the DPIA and also the threat modeling or risk assessment for rolling out new feature or new products. And that's the essence of some of these controls, ensuring that you embed security into the design of a new feature, new processes, or a new product, and also to ensure that by default, you are not collecting personal data which you don't need. And some of these things are actually much more detailed in some of the reference materials which I've seen. A quick explanation as regards some of the controls which you need to put in place when it comes to personal data, right? I've talked about anonymization there, which, like I said, is totally anonymizing the data, right? And when you anonymize the data, it renders it non-personal data, right? It's not under the scope of data protection regulation, as far as I know, according to the GDPR. But there's also pseudo-anonymization. And the reason why I'm pointing it out here is that people make the mistake of pseudo-anonymizing and terming it as anonymizing the data, right? Both terms are actually mentioned under GDPR and also some data protection regulations. When it's anonymized data, truly anonymized, there's really nothing to worry about because you've sort of de-identified the data. People cannot pick out an individual with the residual of that data. So, for example, my name is Nurudeen, and my last name is Odeshina, right? And I sort of anonymize that completely, and I call myself XZ. And someone hears XZ somewhere. It really doesn't make any sense to anybody. But if I say NO, I've pseudonymized it, but someone can still sort of infer from it that, yeah, maybe that's my name, right? Two different things. Anonymizing and also pseudonymization. Most data protection regulation also talks about encryption, right? Which is quite different from anonymization and pseudonymization, right? And I'll have a joke about that in the next few slides. And this is what really encryption really is all about, right? It's either you're using PKI, the asymmetric encryption, or using symmetric encryption, where you're using just a single key to encrypt and decrypt, or using two different sets of keys to encrypt and decrypt. And you also have the one-way hashing. And a funny example happened, right? In one of the organizations where I worked with, we outsourced some processes to the third party, right? And the third party was breached, right? Their database was breached. And the first question we asked them is, no, the database has been breached. What really happened? No, no one is all encrypted. Okay, no problem. We won't worry. Where are the encryption keys? That's the next question. Why the encryption key is also compromised? If that happens, then there's really no, if it's encrypted, it makes no sense anymore, right? Because the guys who breached the organization also have the encryption keys. So those are the kinds of questions you also want to ask when it comes to encryption. So when we breached, don't just hear, oh, it's all encrypted data. Don't stop there. Go to the next step, right? Do you have the keys, or the keys were also actually breached? And a friend of mine used to say this, right? The security incident is not necessarily a data breach, and also a breach is not always a data breach, right? So breach means different things. It's always good to put things within the scope. You could have a breach of the network and there's no data exfiltration. That means no data was lost, right? So we also need to put things in context. So, and the media example, the media is very, very important here in passing this message. All we hear in the media is there's been a breach. And everybody just starts worrying, oh, my data is out there. But maybe it's not a data breach. Right? Maybe no data has been exfiltrated. Or maybe no data was lost. Right? Or maybe it's encrypted data without the keys. Right? One of the key principles of data protection, and I'll spend some time on this, is around accountability, right? And that's the essence of the privacy program by itself, right? Today, organizations cannot do without personal data. If that's the scenario, then they need to be accountable. And being accountable really is around ensuring that you have a privacy program. And I say to people, if there's no data, there can be no breach. But if you collect data, you need to ensure that you actually protect that data. And that's what accountable means as an organization and also as a privacy officer. I'm wrapping up real quick. I think that a privacy or data protection presentation can never be complete without talking about some of the principles of data protection. And there are key principles which you need to embed at every phase within your privacy program or within the life cycle of you building the product. The first one, lawfulness, fairness, and transparency. And really, that is what is being preached in every religion today, right? Treat your neighbor just like you treat yourself. And that's what lawfulness, fairness, more importantly, means. Lawfulness basically means that you actually have the lawful basis, not legal. You have the lawful basis to actually process the data. And legal is just one of those lawful bases. There can be other lawful bases for you to process the data, right? Purpose limitation, ensuring that the reason why you've collected the data is the reason is what you're using the data for, right? So the guys in IT collect employees' data, right? When you join an organization, IT sort of collects some of the employee data to use to create your Active Directory account or your identity and access management information. We want organization where I work. We wanted to conduct a survey, but the survey is not conducted internally within the organization, it's conducted by a third party. And we decided that the third party says they need everybody's first name, last name, and also email address. It was a difficult case, right? We asked ourselves privacy questions, right? Will employees be okay with this in terms of we sharing the data out to a third party, name, first name, email address, and some other sensitive information because they need that for the survey. It's a brand health survey. We wanted to know how employees feel. But that speaks to purpose limitation. When we're collecting that data initially, we said the data is for setting up the user account. Now we're using that data for something else. Right? So we need to think about some of these things when it comes to purpose limitation. We ended up doing that, but we didn't share out email address. These are some other approach to actually do that. Data minimization. Don't collect data which you don't need. Right? A good example of that is most websites today, they will ask you for a date of birth, the full date of birth. Most of them don't need that information, right? Maybe they just need your age range, for example, I'm between 20 and 25, or I'm between 18 and 20, I'm between 7 and 5, or 7 and 10. So that's really around what data minimization means. And the reason why data minimization is very, very important is it sort of reduces the extent of data which you hold as an organization. It reduces your data estates, and which in turn also reduces the amount of storage which you need to provision for when it comes to storing data. You also need to worry about accuracy, keeping the data up to date as much as possible. Storage limitation, I talked about that earlier on. Limit the storage of the data. When data is no longer required, just purge it. Right? There's no point keeping it. Integrity and confidentiality. Like I said, security is the aim's artist when it comes to privacy and data protection. For all the controls which we talked about today, it's really as a result of that principle when it comes to data protection. Integrity and confidentiality. And that's why, as a privacy professional, you absolutely need your information security professionals. You cannot protect the data. You need the security professionals to advise you on how best to actually protect the data, right? So all these controls I mentioned, anonymization, pseudonymization, encryption, you are not going to be the one doing that as a vice professional. You need the advice of your information security team to advise you on how best to actually protect the data, to store the data, and also things around granting access to the data. Which is why privacy and security, they are very much hand in hand, right? And lastly, I think I talked about accountability. Some of the other things which you need to do or which you need to worry about as privacy professional or as Walter, as privacy chief privacy officer, will be things around the DSARs, right? The subject access request. People would write to you and say, what data do you hold about me, right? You need to institute the process to actually respond to that. There are vendors, right, which you need to onboard. Don't forget to do your PIA for those vendors too, right? Your privacy impact assessment, because you're going to share data with them. So you need to understand what their process is when it comes to data and how they protect the data. When the breach happens, I said when, not if. When the breach happens, you need to also ensure you have processes in place to actually respond to that breach. Training, education, and awareness team, just like you take a cup of tea every morning, or maybe coffee. Make sure that regularly you also have training, education, and awareness. You need to respond to auditors based on from legislation. Auditors will always come knocking. Ensure that you measure the success of your privacy program as much as possible. And that's the only way Walter can actually demonstrate year in, year out is actually improving the privacy program. Regulation and standards, we need to track them and also at some point in time automate. So I've not talked about tools all through, right? But lastly, I'm talking about tools. I'm a big believer in starting small, manual processes, then automate. And be ready to listen and also seek guidance. And the last one is just this, right? On a regular basis, the day-to-day of the privacy officer really is around how can I help? People will come to you with questions about new products, new processes, new features. And your day-to-day really, other than everything which I've mentioned, is around providing advisory, guidance, and also support when it comes to data protection. And that's really what your day is as a data protection officer. I'll summarize. I have give us these 5 things. Data protection is about people. Keep it human as much as possible. Personal data is not the new oil. People say that all the time, right? Oil is for exploiting. You exploit oil and get some materials from it. Don't think about personal data like that, right? Because that will mean that you're exploiting humans, which is not a very good thing. It doesn't sound right? Treat it as something very important. Keep it human and also try to protect the people who actually own this personal data. Always remember the 7 gold principles, right? Accountability and also all the other principles. Putting security controls in place, that's what's called appropriate technical and lifestyle measure. And also, as much as possible, be the best you can be, and also collaborate with everybody. And if there are any questions after this, I don't have answers to it, because every answer in data protection really starts with depends. Thank you very much, guys.